And welcome to another video. Today we're going to be discussing the anatomy of a scene. To start off, we have to figure out what a scene is. A scene is when something takes place. Yes. The definition of a scene, as described by a MasterClass article, which I will link in the description box, is that it is a section of the story that contains a unique setting, character, dialogue, as well as sphere of action. And in order to get more into this, you have to first look at what is the purpose of this scene. Why are you writing it? Why do you want to include it in this story? While you could be writing it just because it sounds fun and also because you wanted to experiment with it, it is important that it still provides some kind of development, be it plot or character. A scene is comprised of 4 components. A, the purpose, which we've just discussed. B, conflict. Usually this is conflict between the characters or the conflict of the story as a whole. C, goals of the characters involved in the scene or the singular character that's in the scene. And lastly, D, the dramatic action in which everything takes place as. In order for a scene to actually have some substance, you're going to need, obviously, the components that we talked about in the original definition of a scene. And that would be setting, character, dialogue, and a sphere of activity. We've already mentioned the dramatic action, which is the most obvious part, as well as the conflict and goals, which are attributed to the character. You want to start with setting when you think about a scene. A setting can often dictate the mood that you want the scene to have, or can influence the mood of the scene as you continue to write. You want to include things like the 5 senses, what they are seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and feeling. What they come into contact with throughout this entire scene can also influence how they, as characters, would normally react to certain things. And also, when you throw in something weird in a setting, or if they've been to a place they've never been before, it's a good way to test your boundaries and how you want to develop their character. Next, you have your characters. Your characters are obviously the cast that you have decided to put forward in this scene. They can be your protagonist and side characters, protagonist and antagonist, or antagonist and side characters that are interacting with them. How they interact also develops the character as a whole. By including these characters, you're moving the plot and the character development along. It's also very important to note that you can also change up the way characters talk, and by using the dialogue, which is included in the main component of what a scene is, you can also develop the character. Their style of speech and how they deliver a certain message would also develop them. I use also a lot, don't I? Last, you have sphere of activity or dramatic action. Sphere of activity or dramatic action, whichever words you would like to use for it, would encompass what a character is doing in that scene, what is happening around them, how are they reacting to things. These also develop character because you can put forward little tics and things that they do when they're nervous, when they're upset, when they're happy, when they're sad. These are important things to note because obviously they're going to appear throughout the story as you write them, and they add more substance to the scenes. You can include them through gesture as well as putting them in between dialogue. When I first started writing with immersive third, what I would do was obviously chop out the dialogue tags. This allows you to focus more on how they're delivering this, how they're delivering their sentences, how their voice sounds, and the things that they do that accompany their words. Sometimes you can have a character that says one thing, stirs a spoon in a cafe, or they don't say anything or don't do anything, and you can convey a whole lot with just that. With all these components put together, you can create a wonderful scene. I'll be using a couple examples to illustrate what I've just talked about and how best you can go forward in using them, as well as also an exercise you can do by yourself or with someone else in a group. The first example I'll be showing is actually the opening scene of a music video by DPR Ian called No Blueberries. It's important to note that while this is a music video, there's still some kind of setup for a story within the video that we're supposed to be paying attention to. It's important to note that whenever you're trying to make a scene, you want it, especially if it's the opening scene, to be gripping in some way to hold the reader's attention. from what we've seen, we've now gotten a story established, or the start of one established. We can infer that the main character has a conflict with themselves or an other self that is reflected in the mirror and portrayed by lack of colors, as well as a gritty film sort of view. Already we have several of the components that are needed for a scene: the purpose, establishing the conflict, and the conflict of the main character, who is portrayed in the scene by DPR Ian himself. The sphere of action, which we see, is him struggling and looking in the mirror, then pulling out a gun, and then popping pills before he leaves the bathroom, the setting that this takes place in, before he moves on to another setting. This could be one scene or two separated, depending on how you decide to write it. It could be one scene where the character walks and you see them travel to the next location. In doing so, you make the scene longer, but it's not always advised because you don't necessarily need to do it. However, you can have characters leave a location and new characters take their place, making it the same scene or a new scene, depending on how you would like to go about it. My next examples are stills taken from scenes of movies. These are considered iconic as by MSN Entertainment, which is the Microsoft News thing. These scenes are all from famous movies that you may or may not have seen or at least heard of. And if you're able to, I suggest watching them just because you can. Additionally, what you can do with this is turn it into an exercise in which you complete the scene yourself, or if you remember the scene from watching the movie, you can pick out parts of the scene that were memorable to you and why, as well as try to remember other details that are not things that you would very readily remember. The first example is taken from Silence of the Lamb, which is about Hannibal Lecter, and it's a wild ride. In this particular still, you see Hannibal with two officers. This is, spoiler alert, this is towards the end of the movie where he's being transferred to a new prison as the agreed upon terms with a congresswoman whose state prison he was located in. As you can see, he's muzzled and bound to a lever thing that's holding him up as these two guards are looking between each other, and what appears to be either confusion or disdain for the man that they have to take care of or watch. Hannibal himself, though, has this unnerving, wide-eyed gaze, which is also characteristic of him. What you can do with this information is turn it into a full scene and where you complete the dialogue, or you think of new dialogue that comes into play, as well as what might be going on inside Hannibal's head, because it is seen mostly from the view of the FBI agents involved through the film. The next example is probably very obvious, but it's from The Notebook. What you can infer from this is that two people love each other very much, enough that they're standing in the rain. You can make of that however you wish. This could be something important. The rain could be something deadly. Take from it what you will. It is an iconic scene and there are two characters, there's a setting, and there's apparently a purpose, but I never really liked The Notebook, so I don't get the purpose. The last example, you have a young Leonardo DiCaprio who never won an Oscar for this particular film. You see two characters who are standing on the bow of a ship, but also on the rails of the bow of the ship, which is highly dangerous, and I don't know why they did this, but hey, makes for a good shot. You have setting and time, which is that the sun is setting, therefore it's getting close towards night. Yeah, that's what happens when the sun sets. The purpose of the scene was supposed to illustrate Jack and Rose's deepening relationship in this point in time. However, we already know that it's doomed. It does not work out well. She pushes him off his door, there was space for both of them on, but you know, that's just how that worked. Now, for the exercise I mentioned earlier on, we discussed another one before, but one you can do is pick a prompt, any kind. You can take a visual prompt, or you could just find one where you pick a object or a place and you move on from there. What you can do is you start by setting up setting, which we know is to be time and place, You can also then infer characters. So MC. Speaking of which, your main character doesn't necessarily have to be the protagonist. It could actually be the antagonist. They could act in an antagonistic way towards other people, which would therefore make them not quite a tragic hero, but also a villain in their own right. So you have your MC, who is either a protag or an antag, and side characters. From there, you can move on by discussing what the conflict of the scene is. You can write it and have it be whatever it is. It could be an alliance or something crumbling. It could be whatever your story needs or that particular scene needs. Conflicts and goals of the characters involved is also the next thing that you want to put on this list. So you have four of the main components there, but obviously you're missing dramatic action. Well, that can go into a lot of things like dialogue and the gesture like we talked before, which I will also include in another video if people would like for it to be a whole separate video. And that is basically it for the exercise. Once you have this set up, you can go on to writing a scene based on what you have. Hopefully this video has been helpful and it'll help you get back to writing as fast as you can and creating awesome scenes for people to read, like me. Send me your scenes. Send me something to read. I will read anything. Anything at all. Anything. I hope you enjoyed and have a great rest of your day.